So you've made it to the last video for Chapter 5. Good on you. Well done. So we're going to look at muscle and nervous tissues in this video and then just do a little, just kind of a summary quick of what we've accomplished in this chapter to help, make sure you're thinking about all the chapter as you go in to prepare for the exam. So muscle and nervous tissue get very short coverage in this chapter, and that's because we're going to be looking at the skeletal system later on. And I'm sorry, not the skeletal system, but we're going to be looking at the muscular system later on. And we'll look at skeletal muscle and in very deep depth there. And then we'll give some more coverage to smooth muscle and cardiac muscle, but they'll even get even more coverage when we start looking at the digestive system for smooth muscle and the cardiovascular system for the heart muscle. And of course, nervous tissues get 3 chapters out of this book. So again, we'll just be introducing them very briefly here. So let's go ahead and get started. So muscle tissue is muscle or are cells that have been adapted to shorten and thicken because of cell movement, the protein fibers, and the work that the protein fibers can do inside of the cell. So muscle tissues tend to be elongated cells. We refer to them as muscle fibers because of that, because they're longer. And as they shorten, these long cells, as they shorten, they pull on the attached ends and cause movement usually of the skeletal elements. But there are other kinds of muscle in the body as well that aren't pulling skeleton but pulling on other muscle or pulling on other tissues. 3 types of muscle tissue are found in the body. There's skeletal muscle. That's the stuff that is connected primarily usually to the skeleton. There's smooth muscle. This is the muscle that lines the digestive tract, the reproductive tract, the urinary tract, all of the inner tubes and containers that are found inside the body. And then finally there's cardiac muscle, which is the muscle that we find in the heart. We'll start by looking at skeletal muscle. It forms the flesh of the body and is usually attached to bones. There are some skeletal muscles that are not attached to a bone. The lips, orbicularis ori, are one of those. So they just attach to other muscles, and so it's the muscles pulling against each other that allow us to move our lips in all the ways that we can do that. The contraction of skeletal muscle is controlled through conscious effort. We're aware of the work that we're doing to try to to make these muscles move. We talk about that then as voluntary muscle. Any muscle that we can control with our conscious mind is a voluntary muscle. The cells of a muscle are long and thin, so if this is me making a big old muscle here with my biceps, because my biceps are that huge, the muscle is attached up here at the shoulder, and it's attached here on the forearm. A muscle cell runs a single cell runs the whole length of that muscle. And so they're super long, very thin. And when we're looking at them under the microscope, we're only seeing a very small section of that muscle. So, here in this picture, we're just seeing a tiny portion of the muscle itself. The cell, and here's a single cell. That cell runs from one end of the muscle to the other. And they are what we refer to as multinucleate. That means that a single muscle cell, a single muscle fiber, will have multiple nuclei along its length. So here's a nucleus for one cell, and there's a nucleus for the same cell, for instance. Here are nuclei that are found in the same cell. Now, this is an unusual condition. Most cells in the body have only a single nucleus, but muscle cells have more than one nuclei. And under the microscope, they have, and this is a key characteristic for skeletal muscle, they have this stripy pattern, and you can make it out here. It goes across the muscle fiber itself. That's the striations. So skeletal muscle is thought of as the voluntary striated muscle. Not every muscle tissue is striated, and not every muscle tissue is voluntary. So we can classify them as voluntary and striated. That would be the skeletal muscle. Smooth muscle doesn't have this striated appearance. So when you look at a sample of smooth muscle, you'll see no striations at all. It appears very smooth. And the cells, rather than being super long, are relatively short. And they're shaped sort of like a spindle. A spindle is the tool at the top of a spinning wheel where we collect the thread that's been spun. And it's kind of got this shape. And so they're described as being spindle shaped. And rather than having multiple nuclei, they only have a single nucleus. And it's somewhat elongated because the cell is longer than it is wide. These do not respond to conscious control. So you cannot think your stomach muscles into grinding up, into contracting and squishing up and squeezing and grinding your food. You cannot think your bladder to contract and void the urine that's in the bladder. You have to do other things. So what we do to avoid the urine in the bladder instead is referred to as the Valsalva maneuver, and we kind of pressurize by squeezing down on the abdominal muscles. We pressurize the abdominal cavity. That additional pressure helps send a signal up to the brain saying, hey, our bladder's getting really stretched. And in response to that, the smooth muscle that controls the opening to the bladder relaxes. The bladder will, the urinary bladder will contract and squeeze out the urine. So it's an involuntary response. We cannot directly tell our bladder to squeeze out the urine. We can't tell that sphincter muscle to relax. So we find smooth muscle in the hollow organs, in the walls of those hollow organs, the stomach, the intestine, the urinary bladder, uterus, blood vessels, so on. So that's smooth muscle. And the third type of muscle is cardiac muscle. And the only place that we find cardiac muscle is in the walls of the heart. These are short cells, again, but they are striated. They have this very particular arrangement of the muscle, the protein fibers inside the muscle that create this appearance of striation. And a key characteristic to cardiac muscle is that it branches. So if this is a cardiac muscle, the ends are branched. There's a nucleus and it has striations. And so these branches connect. Oop, that's not how, well, okay, we'll do it like this. You get the point. Okay, so I get sloppy. Let's try that again. The branches will interconnect so that if this muscle cell gets the signal to contract, it will contract, and that signal to contract can pass through these special intercellular connections that are referred to as intercalated discs. So the intercalated disc, if we were to look at it, take and turn it so that we're looking at it face on, it has desmosomes. If you remember, desmosomes have an attachment inside of the cell, and then these fingers that reach out and lock into each other to hold them. They're very strong, they're very flexible. Now if we look down the pipe of that connection, look at the end, it also has these holes. They're called gap junctions, and the gap junctions allow ions to pass freely from one cell to the next. And so if we get the signal to contract at this cell, which happens by ionic movement, then the ions will flood across the intercalated disc and cause the next cell to contract. Okay, let's see if I can, there we are. So because of these intercalated discs, the cardiac muscle and the branching, so because of the branching and the intercalated discs, cardiac muscle is just supremely designed to be able to conduct rapidly the impulse to contract throughout the heart so that the heart can beat in a coordinated way. So the intercalated discs are what you want to look for as you're looking at cardiac muscle. This is an intercalated disc. This is an intercalated disc. Here they are. So you want to look for that, and I'll make sure that you can see that there are striations in the cells as well. So you can make out some of that striatedness right there if you look in this area here. So can you think your heart muscle to speed up or to slow down? Well, if you think a scary thought, if you can manipulate your emotional responses, yes, you could do that. But it's the emotional response that controls heart rate, not your thinking about creating the emotion. So this is also an involuntary muscle. So it is striated but involuntary. So if we have a muscle fiber, you see that it's striated and it's voluntary, that must be skeletal muscle. If it's striated and involuntary, that must be cardiac muscle. And if it's non-striated and involuntary, then it must be smooth muscle. So I want you to know both the names of them and how we classify them as striated or non-striated, and voluntary or involuntary. Okay, so that's the muscle tissue. And again, we're going to look at that in way more depth when we get to the muscular system. And then nervous tissue, which is found in the brain, the spinal cord, and in the nerves that head out to the periphery of the body. So we talk about the central nervous system and the peripheral nerves that are found out in the body themselves. Central nervous system is axial. We find two cell types in this nervous tissue. There are the neurons. These are the communicating cells. They are specialized to generate and conduct this activity. We're not going to describe it more. It's complex, but we'll get there when we get to the nervous system. They conduct these things called nerve impulses. And they travel from the cell body, where they're generated, down what's called an axon, and then down to the ends where the terminals will connect to one of three kinds of cells, either to another neuron, to a muscle cell that it can tell to contract, or to a gland that it can tell to secrete. And they also have these branching ends here. They're called dendrites. I don't need you to know all these terms. Well, no, I do want you to know dendrites. Dendrites collect information from other neurons, and they transmit that information as a small electrical charge change toward the cell body. And if we get enough of these small electrical charge changes coming in from the dendrites, then that will stimulate the nerve impulse to start. There are also associated with the neurons another type or another set of cells, and there are a number of different types of these cells called neuroglia, or sometimes just talked about as glial cells. It's a G. So glial cells are the small cells that are associated with a neuron that support it both by giving it nutrients and by holding it in place in the tissues. Insulate it. They prevent the electrical charges from sneaking out and going to interrupt other processes. And they can protect the neurons as well by keeping away from the neuron the if you could see me, I'm like, my hands are working, but no words are coming out. They keep away from the neuron any toxins or toxic materials that would disturb the neuron or its activity. So the neuroglial cells are kind of the support services for the neurons. And there's nothing else really that looks like a neuron. You'll see a cell body, you'll see the nucleus in the cell body, and you'll find these processes that leave the cell body and branch away. One of them is an axon, and the others are all dendrites. So that's chapter 5. You've done it. Let's just go back and look at what all you've done. So we talked in the introduction about how cells are organized into the tissues and the junctions, the intercellular junctions that will hold these cells together. and then introduced the four major tissue types of the body: epithelial, connective, muscle, and neural tissues. And then we looked at epithelial tissues, describing their characteristics and functions, and talking about whether they're stratified or non-stratified, or simple, that is, simple or stratified, and whether the cells have a squamous shape, a cuboidal shape, or a columnar shape. And then we looked at the different epithelial types and described where they might be found in the body, and talked a little bit about glandular tissue and how we classify glands, and then described all those general characteristics. Oh, that should have been dadgummit. And so then we talked about glandular tissue. That should be there. So we described, then we looked at connective tissues, described the general characteristics, how they have a specialized cell, an extracellular matrix that's composed of ground substance and protein fibers. And then we compared and contrasted the fibers, the matrix, to think about each of the connective tissue types. We looked at the connective tissue proper, and then also looked at the specialized connective tissues. We described and located the four types of membranes in the body, and then we talked about muscle tissue and we discussed the ways to distinguish among the three types of muscle tissue, and the nervous tissues and the functions and some of the general characteristics of nervous tissues. So there it is. So we will have open lab on Monday night. So Monday night beginning at 4 p.m. you can find me probably in room 208 over there in building 17, and I'll be there, and you can do some more looking, and we'll discuss how it is that you can identify these dang tissues when I toss them up on microscopes for you. All right, so have a great weekend and study hard.